Recently, it seems like a new innovative poker study tool is launched on an almost daily basis. This raises an interesting question of whether poker is experiencing the same trend that we've seen in many other industries. Is it inevitable that poker technology will eventually completely subsume the roles that were previously exclusively held by poker coaches, study groups, and the like? Well, this question still remains to be seen, but in the spirit of this theme, today we're going to compare the strategic advice of an experienced poker coach on the one hand and a solver on the other hand while analyzing the same game. This hand will be played by Brad Owen, who is the most popular poker vlogger on YouTube, and the human side of the analysis will be performed by Bart Hansen, who is a longtime professional poker player and coach.
10-20 with a $20 big blind ante. It's good that they're doing antes because I really hate two blind, just no limit. I mean, it really should be a dead game in terms of how tight people play.
It is interesting. It doesn't actually affect most of the time how big people are raising. In this hand, it does a little bit, but most people are still raising 3x, the good players in it.
So this lineup was mostly good players, but a couple spots. Is that about accurate, would you say?
This guy, the main villain in this hand in particular, was the spot. There was one other rec player, but he was just playing really tight, so there weren't many opportunities to get involved with him. And then everybody else was, a Vegas pro.
Everybody else was a Vegas pro. So let's start it off here. So it seems like you're in the big blind, right? And this is 3K effective. You've got this guy covered, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he opens to 80, 4x, which is larger than everybody else?
Yeah, everybody else is pretty much opening to 60.
Okay, so he opens to 80 from the cutoff, and you're in the big blind, and you have pocket eights.
Yeah, so pretty standard defend.
Mm-hmm. Would you 3-bet this out of the small blind from this configuration?
I know that you're really not supposed to be calling much out of the small blind.
Yeah.
But I probably would call.
Well, at least you're honest.
I mean, I know, I tend to call out of the small blind when I'm not supposed to.
Well, I mean, the deeper you are, the more calls there are out of the small blind, whether or not at 150 blinds. The other thing, though, too, is it's only 2 blinds because you're more incentive to 3-bet for sure, like if there's a straddle in front, like if you were playing 5-10-20 or something like that. So I think there are some calls, but I would probably tend to 3-bet this. But obviously out of the big blind, whether you want to 3-bet or not, it's fine. Probably calling, I would say, is standard-ish, right, with eights.
Yeah, just see a flop. You're closing the action, so don't have to worry about someone. You don't have to worry about someone behind you 3-betting.
Right.
So this hand takes place at the Bellagio in a 10-20 game with a $20 big blind ante. Villain in the cutoff, who apparently is a gigantic fish, opens it to $80, and Brad calls in the big blind with pocket eights. So here are the default pre-flop ranges selected by the solver, which is for a 100 big blind 6 max game with a 12.5% ante. So obviously there are a few differences between the actual hand played and this default range. For one, the stack sizes in the actual game are around 150 big blinds, and the cutoff open to 4x, whereas this default range assumes a 2.3x raise. So on the one hand, with the larger raise, you could assume that the actual ranges should be much tighter, but on the other hand, the actual game had a larger ante, and the villain is a recreational, which likely means he's opening wider than optimal, so perhaps these differences wash out. Now, some of you live players watching this may be thinking to yourself that these ranges are likely very far off from how most live recreational players play preflop, and you would probably be right. And if we knew the exact range of villain, it would probably make sense to input that range here instead of these default ranges. However, if we don't have a sufficient sample size on how villain plays preflop, the safest option will be to assume that his range is somewhat close to GTO. And we can do this because when we assume our opponent is playing GTO, even when that assumption is wrong, the resulting strategies will still be effective since GTO is by definition unexploitable. In contrast, when we assume our opponent's range and strategies materially deviate from GTO and craft exploitative counter strategies based on that assumption, if our initial assumption turns out to be wrong, our exploitative counter strategies will leave us vulnerable. So in this instance, we're going to go the more conservative route and assume villain and hero are playing somewhat optimal ranges. And we see that according to this sim, pocket eights call 82% of the time and 3-bet 18% of the time.
Right. So the pot's 190 because of the ante, right? And you get a pretty good flop, right?
Yeah, flop comes 8-3 deuced with 2 spades, so we flop top set, and we're against the right guy. Unfortunately, we're not in position, but still seems like a great opportunity to potentially stack this guy.
So if I assume you're going to check, and then if he bets, are you check raising right away? Because the reason why I asked that is that I could see myself certainly playing this hand differently against this guy versus one of the pros, because if you were playing against one of the pros, this type of board is like one that a guy could just triple barrel off, right? Like super dynamic. Guys are good enough to try to, they'll take 3 streets with an overpair. They'll represent overcards, and they'll also value bet if they actually run into top pair.
Yeah, this is interesting because I'm not actually going to have any 2 pairs on this board, right? So there's no range advantage despite it being a low board for me.
Well, right. If he's opening all of the pairs,
which I imagine he would from the cutoff.
Yeah, everyone sort of has a nut advantage. I would say like range advantage wise, because you didn't 3-bet, he's going to have more overpairs than you if you're going to 3-bet off like queens plus. But you have some combo draws here like 4-5 suited, ace-4, ace-5 that might not be 3-bet off.
Yeah, but he's going to have a lot of those too from the cutoff. So
I'm just saying that you can balance this if you want to raise with some bluffs too.
Yeah, I think that I would probably tend towards calling flop and then checking turn as well.
Even against this guy too?
I think so.
Yeah. But that doesn't happen.
No. So I check and he immediately checks back. So in my mind, it seemed like he had zero interest in on this flop. So
that's the worst feeling in the world when you're like, there's one spot at the table, you flop a set, and not only do you have to flop a set, right? Like he has to have something to stack off with, right? Too.
Yeah.
So
I've been kind of waiting all session for this opportunity to get a big hand against the right player, and then I do, and he doesn't seem like he has anything that he wants to at least take a stab at the flop with. So I assume he just has some high cards, essentially.
So just a quick check.
Yeah.
So Brad checks and Villain checks behind. It seems that both Brad and Bart assumed, as a foregone conclusion, that Brad should be checking here despite flopping the nuts, and the solver agrees. They noted that despite the fact that the board is low, Villain likely has a range advantage, particularly due to overpairs, and this assessment bears out when we examine the equity distributions of both players. We see that the distributions are actually pretty close throughout most of the range, but there is some separation here at the top. And if we zoom in on and isolate this area, we see that hands with around 75% equity or more comprise around 15% of the Villain's range and only around 2% of Brad's range. And this is largely due to the massive overpair advantage for the cutoff. So being out of position and at a range disadvantage, a pure check here in Brad's shoes does make sense. That being said, Bart also notes that the big blind should have some decent equity hands on this board, which is also an important factor to consider. Right, especially with the ante in play, the big blind should have a ton of 2x and 3x, as well as plenty of hands that wrap these cards, such as 4-5 and 5-6, and ace-4 and ace-5 of both the suited and offsuit varieties. So although the cutoff likely has the advantage here, the big blind should have plenty of decent equity hands that will not just autofold to any bet, which explains why the overall equity distributions are relatively close and why the cutoff is doing a significant amount of checking, over 40% of the time. If we compare the same cutoff versus big blind spot with a different board, such as ace, king, queen, we see that the cutoff has a much stronger advantage on this board, and this translates into essentially a pure range bet.
So the turn
is the 4 of spades. So flush draw gets there, and a couple of straights get there that seem kind of unlikely just based on his immediate check back on the flop.
Right.
I think that if he had a flush draw, for instance, he would have at least considered betting and probably would have thrown out a bet. Mm-hmm. So not concerned about it. I bet 100 for value, and I'm hoping for at least a call.
Right. The other thing, too, about the 4 is that it brings in a wheel draw. So if he had some ace highs like ace 10, ace jack, he might peel any high spade, like did he, just a single spade that wasn't bet off on the flop.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's, a lot of combos of those where he's going to have ace king, ace queen with 1 spade in his hand.
And for that reason, I would definitely bet. Like, there's no sense to try to check and let the guy check behind again. I mean, that would be ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
On the turn.
Yeah.
So you bet 100 and he calls.
Yeah. And so, I still put him on those hands, those ace-queen, ace-king hands with one spade.
The turn is the 4 of spades, and Brad bets a bit over half pot, and Villain calls. So both guys here seem to agree that probing with top set, despite the flush and straight draws getting there, is basically mandatory, and the solver agrees, as we see that sets are betting nearly 100% of the time. As Brad mentioned, Villain probably should have been betting many of his flush and straight draws on the flop, and we do indeed see that the solver was betting its flush draws and open-ended straight draws around 80% of the time. So Brad's set is still ahead of the vast majority of the cutoff's range, and therefore it has a strong incentive to get value with only one street to come, and the strong possibility that the cutoff will check back again, especially since this card does not hit his range well. Also, we see that after Brad's half-pot bet, there are plenty of worse hands in Villain's range that can call, including, as both guys mentioned, a lot of ace-highs with a spade. In fact, according to the solver, 100% of these combos should defend, including hands as weak as ace-7 with a spade. And we see that even without the flush draw, stronger ace-highs with the over and wheel draw are calling quite often as well.
So the pot's 390 now, right? Because you bet 100 into 190 and he called. And it's somewhat of an interesting river, right? The ace of clubs now.
Yeah, the ace of clubs is the river, so I figure he's going to have a lot of top pair hands. I don't think that he's going to have straights because I think that he might have bet, ace-5 hands, 5-6 hands on the flop. So, and 4-5 if that happens to be in his range.
Because it's a one-liner to a 5, right?
Right.
8 deuce 3, 4 ace, and sounds like the type of guy that very well might just hero you with, like if you ran into an ace 2.
Right.
Yeah.
And so what happens...
So I'm assuming you're planning on betting.
I am planning on betting, yeah. So what happens is he bets, 300 out of turn?
So he bets 300 out of turn. So let's stop for a second. So you don't do anything. And by the way, this is picked up on the blog. You don't do anything. He just bets, and he's in position.
Right.
And you're like, the fuck are you doing? Right?
Yeah. So I wasn't sure, because he didn't seem like he had a ton of experience playing, or at least didn't study the game seriously. He knew the action on the flop and on the turn, or at least knew where the action was, and then all of a sudden bets out a turn here on the river, which I thought was very odd.
So you don't think he's necessarily angling, what doesn't really matter because the bet's staying. So now you basically have an inadvertent check where he bets out a turn, so the action's on you. Obviously, it's open to a raise. I'm kind of scratching my head here, though, because that bet size, you said it was like 300 on a one-liner, like a guy like this, isn't he just going to check behind with a lot of ace-x? So even if he's like really weighted towards a lot of bluffs, if he's not betting ace-x for value, and then once in a great while he runs into actually having a 5, or somehow like he played like pocket aces in a very weird way, just like 1 out of 100, like where you get overset or something like that. I'm not too keen. I don't know. I'm not too sure here about, because of that sizing, what if I would raise here at the end.
Yeah. So I thought it was. So first of all, I wasn't sure if this was intentionally betting out a turn or not.
Uh-huh.
If it's genuine, sure, he could just be super excited about the river and be betting because he's excited, and he had a brain lapse and forgot where the action is.
Right.
If it is an angle, then I was thinking it's possible that he's trying to put like a reverse blocker bet, or like trying to fake strength or something, or.
But that's a big bet, though, right? I mean, bet 300
into
like 390.
Yeah. Which is a good argument against kind of that train of thought, essentially.
Well, I mean, sometimes in the heat of the moment, it's interesting. So what did you end up doing?
I ended up going for a very thin value raise. So I made it 1,000, just thinking that if this is the type of guy that can't even follow the action in a poker hand, then he's probably the same type of guy who might call a river raise with ace king or ace queen potentially.
Yeah, I mean, I understand your line of thought. I think this is why I love this hand because of like the live intangibles of playing a recreational player. I feel like a lot of these guys are so sort of showdown oriented when the board gets scary. Like if he does have ace king, ace queen, and let's say he didn't bet out a turn and you check to him,
yeah,
I don't know if he's like betting the 300. So again, I go back to he could be bluffing here 90% of the time,
and then a raise doesn't,
and then have value 10% of the time, but the value that he has you beat.
Sure.
So it's like a polarized. He's very weighted towards bluffs,
yeah,
but still. And then of course you have to think about will he call your raise too if he happens to like bet something kind of dumb at the end for value.
Yeah, I didn't necessarily think that it was a bluff. I just thought, I really thought he had an ace. Like that was, and sometimes I go with these kind of intuitions, and a lot of the time they work, and then, some of the time they don't.
What about just like clicking it up to like 650 or something like that? Did that cross your mind?
I think that he calls with a lot of one pair hands.
Yeah.
I just thought like, I don't know. I felt that he was like, this is the amount that I'm willing to put in the middle, this 300.
Yeah. And
then I thought, well, if I haven't beat, and I'm fairly certain of it, then I might as well raise it up. And so I ruled out all the flushes. I ruled out pretty much all the straights that he could have, and I didn't even really consider him having aces since he checked back the flop like so quickly.
So you made it 1,000, and what happened?
He kind of mutters something. I can't really tell what he says, and then he exposes pocket fives. So he tables pocket fives. So he
has a straight.
He rivered a straight, which makes sense the way that he played it, essentially. He
didn't bet the flop, picked up open-ended on the turn.
Yeah, it is kind of surprising that he just checked back the flop with pocket fives immediately.
Yeah.
But other than that, calling the turn makes sense with an open-ender. And I think he might have had the 5 of spades as well. Mm-hmm. So, a flush draw, weak flush draw.
So this is like the absolute insane thing if you ever get into this situation. So it looks like he might fold because there's a flush out there. I mean, I know he's turned his hand up.
Well, the thing is, like,
that would be incredible if you get him to fold.
Against every other player, I would just call the 300, and I would never ever raise. If I respected them. This guy, I didn't have a lot of respect for his game, which is why I raised. So, if I was raising any other player, then I, at minimum, have a 5 with the value hands and likely have a flush there. And so even calling with a 5 would just be to chop. And a lot of the time, you're just losing. So
yeah, because you'd have to drastically overplay a hand for him to be good.
Yeah.
Well,
exactly. So, thanks.
But he's a recreational player, so that didn't happen.
Him betting out a turn made him an extra $700, essentially.
So eventually he made the call.
Yeah. So he did call. When he muttered something, I think he said, like, I'm not folding or something.
Oh, that's very, very unfortunate. How much were you going to bet from up front, if everything?
I mean, I probably would have bet around that amount.
Like 300? Yeah.
I just think that, if he does have ace queen or ace king, he was just not a folder in general.
Right.
So Villain bets out a turn, not giving Brad the opportunity to bet. Brad indicates that he probably would have bet $300 if he had the chance, and we see that the solver also would have pure betted sets, predominantly using the 2/3 pot sizing. These hands are still up at around the 80th percentile of the equity distribution, so they're definitely strong enough to bet. But Villain didn't give him that opportunity, and instead bet $300 himself, and Brad decided to check raise. According to Brad, he made this thin value raise based on the assumption that Villain likely had specifically top pair, based in part on his belief that it was very unlikely that Villain would have checked the flop with any hand that would have made a flush or straight by the river. On the other hand, Bart seems to disagree with this play based on a couple of assumptions. One, he thinks a rec would typically check back ace-x given the dangerous board which contains flushes and 4 to a straight. And 2, he posits that it's unlikely Villain merely has top pair given the size of the river bet, which was relatively large. And we see that the solver tends to agree with Bart here, where the only hands that are raising for value are flushes and nothing else, and a raise with pocket eights loses 8 to 9 big blinds compared to just calling. And we can see why this is when we go back to the cutoff's river decision, where top pair is mostly checking, and when it does bet, which is only doing with the spade blocker, it primarily uses a much smaller sizing. Now, some of you may be thinking to yourself, okay, well, that's the GTO strategy, but a live recreational fish isn't playing anything close to GTO. And yes, this is true, but since solvers don't actually know what GTO is and are essentially just EV maximizing calculators, if we want to see what the profit maximizing strategy looks like against a rec with an inbound strategy, we can simply change the solver's inputs to match our assumptions about villain's play, and then recalculate the EV maximizing counter strategy in response. So let's use Brad's assumption as our inputs and only allow the cutoff to check 10% of its flush and straight draws on the flop, and force the cutoff to bet 100% of the time with its strongest ace-x and 50% of the time with its weaker ace-x on the river. And when we recalculate against this strategy, we now see that pocket eights do in fact raise pure, because there are now many more worse hands in the cutoff's range that can call. So putting aside the actual conclusion of this hand to avoid being results oriented, whose strategy was right here? Was the correct play in Brad's shoes simply calling here as Bart was more inclined to do, or was the correct play raising based on Brad's exploitative assumption? Well, this is something that's impossible to say with any definitive certainty. If, as Brad assumed, most wrecks in this spot show up with top pair and basically no straights or flushes, then according to the solver, raising with pocket eights is the profit maximizing play. But the rub, of course, is that we rarely will know if our assumptions about how our opponents play are actually good. However, what we can say with definitive certainty is that simply calling Brad's shoes would have been an effective, unexploitable strategy. That is, no matter who Brad was up against or how they actually play, whether versus a clueless wreck or the best player in the world, or a tight-knit or a spewy maniac, the GTO strategy calculated by the solver will always be effective regardless. So who wins this edition of Man vs. Machine between Bart Hansen and the solver? Well, both Bart and the solver's advice on how to play this hand in Brad's shoes were essentially the same. Of course, the solver strategy will always be more precise and is objectively measurable, but on the other hand, Bart offered certain exploitative insights regarding how recreational players tend to play, which you simply cannot learn from a solver. So overall, I'd have to call this one a draw. That's the video for today. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay balanced.